you. And did any of you hear about us on the Facebook advertising thing? No, I'm going to give that one up. Okay. Thanks for market research contribution there. So good, the ISO publicity is working really well. Or you might have seen our A5 poster at the cheese shop. That's the other. You're the spearhead of my marketing. So anyway, it's all working. And welcome everyone. So for those of you who are new, we are a public club. That's how you got in. And we meet once a month with time off for good behaviour in the summer and for panto season, of course, in December. Other than that, we meet every month on a Tuesday towards the end of the month. And if you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up on the OSO website if you haven't already done that. We send out a couple of emails before each talk. I'm Nick. I've been chairing the club since the joyous days of Zoom philosophy discussions during COVID. That was a happy time for all of us, but it's so nice that we have a growing group of people coming in person. We're supported by the Royal Institute of Philosophy as well as the OSO. And I understand we're one of the most successful local philosophy clubs, if you can imagine, in the country, if not the galaxy. That support allows us to offer free tickets to anyone who needs one, as well as the lowish ticket price for everyone else. So if you'd like to suggest a speaker or offer to give a talk yourself, it does happen. You can contact me through the OSO website or by coming and talking to me afterwards. That's also allowed. And you can see a range, encouraged you. You can see a range of our previous talks on our channel on YouTube. So we do record. If you haven't yet put your phone on silent, this would be a great moment to do it. Doesn't matter if it goes off while I'm talking. But we try and keep fairly quiet during Derek's talk. And we have first of all, a presentation and talk from Professor Matravers, Derek, of about 40-ish minutes. And then we're going to open it up for a Q&A in the room, and then possibly a quick extra Q&A in the bar afterwards if people would like to stay for a chat. We're going to have to get Derek off for a meal at some point, so we won't stay all night, but please do come and say hello. And each year we do a very broad theme, which fits a wide range of talks within it. But we've been thinking this year about the nature of the self, the relationship we have with other people and with the state. So this has encompassed everything from whether AI is ourselves, through to a great talk we have tonight, I anticipate, on T.E. Hulme, who I think is the second best Hume in philosophy. We'll find out. Philosophy joke, very good.
Never good at spelling.
I think we say Hume, though, don't we?
I think we do.
I think we do. Okay, good. It works phonetically. So, Professor Derek Matravers actually interviewed me for university last millennium when I went to study. So, indirectly responsible for all of this. So yeah, very much appreciate that. He himself read for a degree at UCL and then went on to Darwin College, Cambridge, was a postdoctoral research fellow and then moved to the Open University in '94. He's written on aesthetics, philosophy of art, ethics, and the philosophy of mind, and is a fellow of Churchill College at Cambridge, as well as having held visiting positions at universities around the world. So well qualified to address us tonight. And tonight, Derek's going to be talking about the philosophy of T.E. Hulme, who has been called the first conservative of the 20th century. and was described by T.S. Eliot as classical, reactionary and revolutionary, which we think was a compliment from T.S. Eliot. We'll find out. And Derek's going to talk a little bit about Hume's thinking on the relationship between the individual and the state, and his view of human nature. So I think a sort of pessimistic view, really.
Yes.
But we'll find out more about that and what he thought could be done about it from Derek. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to Paul for inviting me. This is my second appearance at the Barnes Philosophy Society. It's very nice to see Cillian again. And last time I had an absolutely splendid time, and gave a talk, was royally entertained, and Barbie said to me, "What's the point of that?" So I thought this time, when I heard about the theme, I thought, well, I'll write something which I hope is more obviously relevant than the. And I should say I completely agree in retrospect. I think the judgment was completely right. But I hope this is slightly more obviously relevant. In one of those things where you send the abstract in, and then you start to write the paper, and the paper ends up being slightly different from the abstract. I'm not going to talk much about Hume, although he is the start of this paper, and he is the reason that I wrote it. So Hume was an interesting character. Sorry, wrong way. Down. He, the handsome chap, obviously. He has many distinctions. One of which was that he was actually expelled from Cambridge twice, both times for misdemeanors with. He was a sex maniac, really. He was obsessed with sex, and that led him, as I say, he was expelled once. Him and his friends campaigned for years, saying it was all a terrible error, and he really needed to get back to Cambridge. So eventually the university relented, let him back, and exactly the same thing happened about 6 months later, and he was expelled again. They didn't give him a third chance. He was an Imagist poet. He wrote poetry which Eliot liked, great influence on Ezra Pound, and he wrote several essays in the first decade of the 20th century, really. And he also was an expert on Bergson, the French philosopher, and he was planning a book on aesthetics and the philosophy of art, which is how I got first interested in him, which looked as if it would be very good. He had sort of sketched what it would be, but in the 1917, he was literally blown to bits. A sort of bomb landed next to him, so I don't think he's even buried anywhere. But one of his essays, 1911, was Romanticism and Classicism, and this is when Paul told me the theme, I remembered this bit from Romanticism and Classicism, which has always intrigued me. So he says in his essay that there's two kind of views of human nature. There's the romantic view and the classical view. And the romantic view, he says, the romantic view has been taught by Rousseau that man was by nature good, and it was only bad laws and customs that had suppressed him. Remove these, and the infinite possibilities of man could have a chance. And then classicism is the opposite. One can define the classical quite clearly as the opposite of this. Man is an extraordinarily fixed and limited animal whose nature is absolutely constant. And it is only by tradition and organisation that anything decent can be got out of him. And so these are two very different views. So what kind of thing, it's fairly obvious what he had in mind, but let me just spell it out with a couple of examples. So if you're a romantic, might draw succor from the thought that, if you look at our prison population, for example, many of the people who end up in prison are people who suffer from disadvantages such as poverty or other external things that means their lives are not going to go well. So you might think there, oh, well, what's landed these people in trouble, what's landed these people in prison is not so much a part of their inner nature, but it's the way the world has affected them. Get rid of poverty and in some way human nature will flourish and people will reveal themselves there as being naturally good. I was trying to think of a good example of classicism, and actually the one that came up best for me was a friend of mine who's very good with dogs, and his dog Mac. So when he got Mac was a very skittish, very unhappy dog, very anxious, skittish, unhappy dog. And Johnny Kine is very, as I say, good with dogs. Sort of trained Mac, gave him sort of great discipline in his life. And the next time I saw him, he was a much happier dog. He had kind of, had his doggy personality realised by being trained, and he was just clearly a much happier dog. So the thought again would be, and you might think of to move out of the four-legged animal kingdom. You might, a friend of mine's son in American, not that it makes a difference. He had gone off the rails, so he was in trouble with the law, taking drugs, etc., etc. He wanted to put himself together, joined the army. The army just turned out to be exactly the right thing for him. So he is now a much happier person. So that's the kind of classicism view that we are kind of flawed animals. We can't do it on our own. Where we need something external, and Hume puts about, say, tradition and organisation that imposed on us, so anything decent can be got out of us. And Hume thought, well, and this is interestingly, this is a theme that runs through philosophy, particularly in the 16th, 17th, and possibly even the 18th century, and it sort of dies down a bit. But it is a sort of background in political philosophy, and it's quite what made my ears prick up when I read this bit of Hume, as I thought, oh, I can see how that kind of plays through in political philosophy in various ways, even up to today. So this isn't really a paper, really. It's just a sort of an exploration which I hope will generate some thoughts and discussion about how this theme does crop up. I was reading around in thinking about this and writing this paper. At some stage, John Stuart Mill, who'll crop up again, says, this is surely a crucial issue for thinkers, for philosophers, and yet it's horribly under-researched. What human beings are like. Why might it be horribly under-researched? Well, I think the obvious reason, which Mill himself was very keen on pointing out, was that it's very difficult, because in a way it's an empirical question. You think, well, what are human beings like is something that you could study and you come up with the right answer. You went out with your clipboards and asked questions and so on and so forth. But Mill pointed out, well, who are you going to ask? Because the only people you can ask are people who already live in a society, and if they already live in a society, you don't know what part of their nature comes from the society in which they live and which part of it they would have had anyway, if you like. So the only people you can ask are already people who are distorted by society, so they're already people whose natures might be hidden by the circumstances in which they've been brought up. And this will crop up later, but I'll mention it now, that Mill, for Mill, this was his great feminist point, was that when he was writing in the mid-19th century, people were, the standard argument against giving women the vote and so on and so forth was just look at women, all they do is sew and etc., and they don't play an active part in public life. And Mill said, well, that's because this is exactly how society has made them. This is what society expects of them. So you can't tell what people would have been like by looking at how they are now, was Mill's big point. And that's maybe partly underpins why this question is so difficult to investigate empirically. Although, and I'm happy to pick this up on Q&A, there's now a reasonable amount of psychology trying to find out what our fundamental motivations are, whether they might be altruistic or whether they might be something else. So that's the kind of contrast I'm going to look at. This idea, and it's a bit simplistic, of course, this idea that either humans are kind of naturally good, and the influence that might have on political philosophy, or Hume's other view that either that human beings are kind of imperfect and flawed, and somehow they need to be constrained in order for anything decent to come of them. Hume himself was inclined to classicism, hence his what was the phrase, conservative, 20th century's first conservative.
Yes.
And I'll come back to that as well. But the debate really does go back a long way. And so this is going right back to the Confucian tradition. So this is roughly contemporary with Socrates. So Mengzi, or Mencius, he was an optimist, he was a romantic. He said, so I'll just read this out. Mengzi said, "The reason why I say that all human beings have hearts that are not unfeeling toward others is this. Suppose someone suddenly saw a child about to fall into a well. Anyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion." It's interesting what he says now. Not because one sought to get in good with the child's parents, not because one wanted fame among one's neighbours and friends, and not because one would dislike the sound of the child's cries. So actually, that is really interesting, because that is very much what the contemporary psychologists are doing to rule out other motivations. So it's very easy to show that people will help people in trouble, but there are a number of explanations for the motivation for helping them. One might be just the distress we feel at other people being in trouble. So the reason we help them is to alleviate our own distress. And Mengzi was he was aware that there were all these possible different psychological explanations. But he says, you help the child in the well because you have this, because you just want to help the child, not for these other reasons. But he had somebody write at the same time, Junzi, and Junzi, very similar to Hume, says, "Natural emotions and desires must be transformed as a crooked piece of wood is steamed and then straightened upon a press frame, or a straight piece of wood is curved with a press frame to make a wheel." So again, same idea as Hume or classicism. There's something about human nature that has to be kind of constrained and taught, forced. Human is a tradition and something like that, in order to make something good for them. So you've got the same playing out there. Now, why is this important? Well, it crops up in particular in the 16th and 17th century, and this is where the idea that it's our ideas of human nature determine our ideas about what states should be like. And this, as I say, crops up in the 17th and 18th centuries in debates over the state of nature. So what was this all about? This is fundamentally about the justification of political obligation. So what justifies the claim that we have duties as citizens? So as citizens of a state, we have a duty to obey the law. So we might want to do all kinds of things. I've just got back from an extended stay in Vietnam, where it's against the law to sing karaoke after 10 p.m. If you've ever stayed in Vietnam for any length of time, you will realise why this is against the law. But if you're a Vietnamese person and you want to sing karaoke after 10 p.m, you can't. You feel you can't because it's against the law. So what justifies the claim that we have these duties to obey the law as citizens, which can go very contrary to our desires and inclinations? And this is a big question, maybe even the biggest question in political philosophy. And one view is that one view takes freedom as fundamental. We can only have duties if we have ourselves consent to them. So the thought is that in our natural condition, we're free to do anything. There needs to be some explanation as to why we've consented to limitations on our freedom. Consent is the key. Because if we don't consent to limitations, then there's no justification for people limiting us. And consent, you can see why consent is important. So, for example, consent is important in the medical case. So it's a part of medical ethics that, provided the person can consent, you're not really supposed to do anything medical to them unless they have consented. So people have informed consent. You're not allowed to chop my leg off unless I say you can chop my leg off. So how does this play out in the debate on political obligation? So the question is, well, under what circumstances, what would persuade us to consent to limiting our own freedom? So let's just assume that we're naturally free. What would persuade us to consent to limiting our freedom? So we conduct a thought experiment. So we imagine ourselves with no limits on our freedom, in a state of nature. So no states, no police, nothing, no duties, etc. No limits on our freedom. What would it be rational for us to give up in exchange for benefits unobtainable unless we did so? Okay, so we imagine ourselves in the state of nature. What would it be rational for us to consent to? What freedoms would be rational for us to give up in return for something? So let me just spill out a bit more. So you might think, well, in the state of nature. So what is the state of nature? So this is just what it sounds like. You know, there's no laws, there's no state. There's just all of us living in loincloths in the savannah or something. So you might think, well, one thing I'd be willing to give up is the freedom to roam around in exchange for a bit of security. So I fear being knocked on the head by the person who lives down the road, so I'm willing to give up some of my freedom if we can somehow guarantee that this person's not going to come and knock me on the head and steal my apples, etc. So that's the kind of thought. What would you give up in order to what freedoms would you give up in exchange for what? And that's supposed to be the basis after a few steps down the line for an account of political obligation. Now let's going back to what Hume was saying about romanticism versus classicism. Well, the romantic would say, well, given that man is by nature good, people are by nature good, the state of nature does not sound too bad. If we're all by nature good, okay, the state of nature is going to be okay. We would all be helping people who fell into wells, helping those who are hungry, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the romantics, if you are of a romantic state of mind, you do have to look quite hard to justify the move from the state of nature to the civil state. So, for example, someone like John Locke, who was an optimist about human nature, he thought that, partly helped with a few sort of rather substantial religious premises about God, he thought that the state of nature was actually going to be quite a reasonable place. We would be living in peace with each other. There was kind of natural rights, pre-political rights, and so on and so forth. But what he thinks that we do need to move. The thing he thinks that we need, which will justify the move from the state of nature to the civil state, is basically protection of what he calls property. He doesn't mean it in a particular modern narrow sense, but he thought you can't really plan your life in any particular way without some kind of state or structure. You can't earn money to hand on to your children without some kind of structure, etc. So he didn't think that the state of nature was terribly bad. He just thought it was kind of limited in a way that it would limit ambitions to grow. And he took very seriously the biblical injunction that we ought to be productive, the parable of the vineyard. And so he thought it was actually impossible to sort of be productive in the absence of a state. But you do, as I say, you do have to. You don't. If you're a romantic, if you're in a Humean sense, if you're an optimist about human nature, then there's no great imperative to move out of the state of nature because it's not going to be too bad. On the other hand, if you're a classicist and you believe that we're all mean, miserable, bad people, then, as Hume said, certainly by tradition, organisation, that anything decent can be got out of people, then we need to move from the state of nature to the civil state to impose constraints upon ourselves to get anything decent upon ourselves, because without those constraints, we're just going to flounder around. And the great theorist, great classical theorist, is Thomas Hobbes, who I just think has got such a marvellous face. Hobbes was writing English Civil Warish time. He's a tutor to the Cavendish family, the Dukes of Devonshire, etc. And we tend to, it's difficult now, everybody suffers from this. We look back on these people in a slightly patronising way and we think, oh, they did very well for people who didn't know very much. Hobbes had these, what we think of as bizarre beliefs about how to achieve longevity, which included things like going down to the pool and swimming around it backwards 3 times in the cold, and this would make you live longer. If you all look at this and you think this is ridiculous. Hobbes lived twice as long as the average of the time. Okay? So if he lived till about 150 in modern terms. So, and he was a hyper-intelligent person. So I think that part of Hobbes's work is clearly worth looking at. But let's ignore the longevity stuff, and this is Hobbes on the State of Nature. And the lovely thing about Hobbes, he's such a good writer, he famously describes the state of nature in the following way. He says, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as if every man against every man. In such a condition there's no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, no use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." So if you have a kind of classicist view of human nature, you've got a very good reason to think, okay, I want to get out of the state of nature and move into the civil state, and I'm willing to give up stuff in order to move into the civil state. And what Hobbes says is we all agree to give away our power to a single authority, king-ish, and live in a state and obey the laws. So if you're a classicist, you can very easy to move from the state of nature to the civil state. If you're a romantic, less easy. Hume, as we saw, cites Rousseau as the nearest romantic, and he said, I won't go back to the slide, but he said roughly, if Rousseau advocated getting rid of the chains of the state, going back to the state of nature, and everything would be fine. So this is Rousseau, one of my favourite philosophers. And Rousseau said famously, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. So we're born free, but immediately we move into a state or a society, we are in chains. Now, if you're a romantic, and this is Hume's view from that quotation from classicism and romanticism, you might think we should simply throw off our chains, get rid of the civil state, and we would meet the conditions of flourishing. We would be able to just everything would be fine, because we're all naturally good. We get rid of the civil state, we'll all be fine. And this was actually the influence that Rousseau had on European culture in the Enlightenment and immediate post-Enlightenment. So the belief that Rousseau nurtured an uncritical longing for a reversion to some idealized primitivism was amazingly popular, and it sort of generated romanticism. There's a lovely painting, I don't know if anyone knows it, I can't remember who it's by, but it's of Willoughby de Brooke of the aristocrats in Britain and Europe got themselves painted sitting in woods on logs, women were running barefoot through fields, etc. It was all Rousseau's fault, because everyone took him to be saying, well, what we've got to do is get back to the state of nature and we'll all be good. But in fact, Rousseau, I think, is actually much, much more interesting. And so this is what Rousseau actually says. He says, the passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces quite a remarkable change in man. That's the key. For it substitutes justice for instinct in its behaviour and gives his actions a moral quality they previously lacked. Only when the voice of duty replaces physical impulse and right replaces appetite does man, who had hitherto only taken himself into account, find himself forced to act upon other principles and to consult his reason before listening to his inclinations. Although in this state he deprives himself of several of the advantages belonging to him in the state of nature, he gains such great ones. His faculties are exercised and developed, his ideas are broadened, his feelings are ennobled, his entire soul is elevated to such a height that, if this abuse of his new condition did not often lower his status to beneath the level he left, he ought constantly to bless the happy moment that pulled him away from it forever and which transformed him from a stupid, limited animal into an intelligent being and a man. So I think Rousseau's view is complicated. It's that in some way we were not morally depraved when we were in the state of nature, and we may very well be morally depraved now, but we were stupid, limited animals in the state of nature. We just didn't have the faculties that human beings need to have in order to flourish. Those only come with the move to the civil state. So it's a kind of tragic view. We can only become human beings with reason and not stupid and limited by moving to the civil state. But on the other hand, the move to the civil state is also corrupting and depraving. So it's a bit in some ways he's very optimistic. He thinks that we are naturally good. In some ways he's very pessimistic because he thinks that we have to move into the civil state, and moving to the civil state is inevitably going to damn us. And then so once we're in the civil state, and this is the mistake that Hume makes about Rousseau and other people make about Rousseau, even today actually, if you get this. Once we're in the civil state, there's no route back. The most prominent contemporary example, if this is actually what happened, but it's reasonable and fits reasonably well, of people trying to take us back out of the civil state to something like the state of nature. When the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, it's just disastrous. When you could probably bomb somebody into the state of nature, but there's no route, that's Bernard Williams who say, but there's no route back to the state of nature once we're in the civil state, where we've crossed that bridge and we've burnt it behind us. So this changes the question. So it's no longer a question of the justification. I think once one realizes this from Rousseau, we no longer have it. We no longer the state of the social contract stuff starts to look a bit silly. It's not going to give us a justification of political obligation. So the question is not should we leave the state of nature for the civil state, because we have to leave the state of nature for the civil state in order to become reasoning people. But given that we have to leave the state of nature for the civil state, what kind of state should we have? Okay. And so the question then sort of crops up again, because so we've got to leave the state of nature to the civil state. And now we say, okay, but now what kind of state do we want? What kind of state do we need? And then the question of what kind of animals we really are crops up again, because if we are, in Humean terms, romantics, we are, if the romantics are right, if we are fundamentally good, then that would suggest one kind of state would suit us, suit our flourishing. If we're fundamentally flawed and limited, that would suggest another kind of state suits our flourishing. So, so there's a shift. So the pre-Rousseau question is, human nature dictates what kind of civil state to which it would be rational to consent to move from a state of nature. And the post-Rousseau question is, we have to move from the state of nature to the civil state. So the question then is, what kind of civil state best suits human nature? And then the romantic and the classicist, Hume has his answer to this. So the romantic is going to say, well, we need a civil state that minimizes the malign influences that make naturally good people, such as us, bad, such as malign influences will be things like poverty and ignorance. And the classicist is going to say a civil state that imposes the non-malign influences that make naturally feckless people amount to something. So those are kind of the two ideas of the state you get, depending on whether you're going to buy Hume on his romanticism or Hume on his classicism. And that's sort of largely really is what I have to say. But now you can see how this plays out in some philosophy. So Isaiah Berlin wrote a classic essay called Two Concepts of Freedom, I think, Two Conceptions of Freedom, something, where he talked about negative freedom and positive freedom. And negative freedom, he said we've got these two ideas of freedom. Negative freedom basically means freedom from constraint, freedom to do what you want to do. And positive freedom means something like self-realization. And he's saying these two ideas of freedom have played out in the first half of the 20th century. I guess he's writing in the 50s or 60s. So negative freedom is easy to understand. That just means that people, nobody's there to tell us what to do. We can carry out our desires, do what we want to do. But the positive freedom thought is that, well, human nature is such that we have a better side to us and a worse side to us. So, for example, somebody who's in the throes of addiction might, doing what they want to do, being unconstrained, might not be good for them. Okay? They might actually they might want their better nature to be realized. So, so the thought that what Isaiah Berlin wanted to say was, this sounds very plausible and nice, but the trouble is, that put in its political form can be very dangerous, because if you've got some politician saying, I know you say that's what you want, but I know what you really want is, and Berlin makes a good case for this being sort of the underpinning thought of Stalinism and Nazism, etc. So I think it's a more sophisticated essay than a lot of people think. I don't think Berlin comes out wholly for negative freedom. I think he's got some interesting things to say about the relation between the two. But you can sort of see that negative freedom is going to be, so the romantic is going to be sort of, again, thinking about the kind of state that we want. If you're romantically inclined, you might think, well, we want a kind of state where people can do what they themselves want to do. They can carry out their own desires, because if they're basically good, their desires are going to be basically good, and it will lead to their flourishing. While if you're a classicist, you might think, well, if these people are basically flawed, limited individuals, then the last thing you want to do is kind of let them do what they want to do. They've got to kind of do what you tell them to do. So it doesn't quite match up, but you can see why there's more of an affinity for the romanticism for negative freedom, the classicism for positive freedom. Then Mill is a very interesting case. So Mill, John Stuart Mill, sort of great 19th century philosopher. He was, IQ tests are dodgy. IQ tests on dead people are even more dodgy. There's some group in America ran an IQ tests on a lot of people, and Mill came out on top. So he's possibly the most intelligent man who ever lived, etc. But Mill, I think Mill was very troubled by the thought about what human beings were really like. So his two greatest texts, his three greatest texts these days, I suppose, are going to be utilitarianism, on liberty, and on the subjection of women. And all of those are in a way concerned with this question about what human nature is really like. So on liberty, he says that human beings should be free to make their own mistakes, to live, his sort of, the phrase he uses is to have experiments in living, which is a rather chilling phrase, but it's, and because he thought that human beings needed to be free to make their own choices in order to develop as human beings. So I think underpinning Mill's philosophy is a very strong idea, a strong, what he would have called romantic idea. And then opposing Mill was this Cambridge jurist, Fitzjames Stephen, who's not much read these days. But he's a marvelous, like a fire and brimstone preacher. But he thinks that Mill's got this all wrong, and he finds Mill, and it's quite interesting. Because he finds Mill far too individualistic. Because Mill says basically things like, so Mill famously says with the harm principle, the only reason you can coerce somebody, the law can coerce somebody, is not for their own good, but if they're in danger of harming other people. And Fitzjames Stephen says, well, no, that's just talking about the individual, but surely individual behaviour can harm the community. People shouldn't be allowed to just do what they want to do, because that can bring harm to the community. And Fitzjames Stephen has a much more, in Humean terms, classical view of human nature. He just thinks that in some way we need to be filtered through what's good for a community in order to fully realise ourselves as human beings. It's a thread that runs through the whole of philosophy. So you get, famously Aristotle says man is a political animal. Man's character can only be truly realised in the polis and the political system. I think Fitzjames Stevens was tapping into that kind of tradition, trying to argue against Mill that it's not all about what an individual might want. An individual is not going to realise themselves simply by doing what they want to do. Marx is a complicated character, but in a way there's a sort of a strong Humean sense of romanticism that runs through Marx. So Marx, like famously said that if you go to the great religions, they talk about heaven being, or whatever the equivalent in other religions is, as being a wonderful thing to get to and so on and so forth, but there's very little description of what it's like when you get there. And similarly, Marx didn't dwell on what a perfectly communist society would be like. But he did think it would be abundant, and when he does mention it occasionally, so in the German ideology, he says, oh, well, we'll be able to practice literary criticism in the morning and go fishing in the afternoon. You think, weird old idea of the perfect life. And Marx talks about the withering away of the state and the communist society. So I think Marx did think that, freed from the external things that bend our natures, that twist our natures, we are in some sense naturally good. That our full conception of our full flourishing will develop, and it's constrained by bad social circumstances. Well, I mean that's obviously true. We all believe that, but Marx, I think, thought that his program, by releasing us from these bad social circumstances, would allow us to fully develop in the absence of a state. Kant, interesting character, because Kant thought that we had basically two natures. There was our rational nature and our empirical nature. And our empirical nature, I don't think he thought was bad. He just thought it was incredibly unreliable and also very contingent. We were like what we happen to be like, while our rational nature, we're like what we're necessarily like. So you get a very strong line in Kantian ethics about how we need to let our rational natures triumph over our empirical natures. So there's a kind of classical, in Hume's terms, strain in Kant, which is that on their little empirical psychological selves, we're pretty much unreliable, weak, and feckless creatures. But it's actually, we don't need external influences really to make us to achieve self-realization. We need to focus on our rational selves. So for Kant, I mean, what makes Kant stick out here is that for Kant it's not really he's classical in the sense that he thinks that our desires don't naturally tend to the good. We need our reason to keep us in check. But he doesn't think that we particularly need external influence to keep us in check. And then final point. Politically, the anarchists, I mean, all kind of sorts of anarchism. Anarchists basically think that that there is no good justification for political obligation. There's also a strong tendency in anarchism to think that human beings are naturally cooperative. That if we do away with state and authority, etc., things will turn out well. And that's kind of, you might think that's, I mean, Hume would certainly have thought that was an insanely optimistic view. An anarchist, of course, could, arguing in the way that Mill would have argued, would say, well, you only think that's insanely optimistic because it's never been tried. The fact that how people are is no guide to how they could be in different circumstances. So that's the kind of trick. But nonetheless, one might still think it's a bit of a gamble. It's a bit of a bet to bet on romanticism being true, which I do think is a precondition of anarchism working. And then the big problem with classicism, which has been lurking but I haven't confronted, is that when Hume says, we are limited, flawed animals and we kind of need these external constraints, well, one wants to say, yeah, but what external constraints? What is the society? What is this classical society where we're all kind of regimented and we've got to march in particular ways? What's the content of these constraints that are going to make us flourish? And that is the kind of thought that underpins authoritarian fascist societies. We human beings need moulding in a particular way, and we know how to mould them. And it's kind of no surprise. I mean, I don't want to be too hard on Hume, because I say he died in 1917 before the full horror of these thoughts played out in the mid-20th century. But the people he mentions in the essay Classicism and Romanticism are people who went on to found Action Française, which was the kind of fascist group in France in the 30s and 40s. So I think that Hume was a classicist, and I think he did, in as much as he had thought these things through, I think he was a kind of proto-authoritarian fascist, just for these kind of reasons. And that gives us, that's my final point, that gives us a bit of a dilemma, because that's the idea that we're going to say, okay, let's buy the classicist picture and say human beings are flawed, we kind of need to be constrained in order to flourish, but let's just leave it open what those constraints might be. That sounds extremely dangerous, because it's quite possible for bad people to come along and say, I know what the constraints are, I'm going to put society in such a way that we're all marching around in uniforms, etc. But on the other hand, you might think the idea that if we don't need constraints, we should let 1,000 flowers bloom, maybe we should just leave us on our own and everything will be all right. You might think, well, that's just a bit madly optimistic. So we seem to be stuck in this dilemma that neither of the two options that Hume offered to us seems to be terribly attractive. And then I think this opens the door to something which I think is a really interesting area of political philosophy, which is, what are the pre-political or the non-political things that operate in a society that keep the society on track? And what do I mean by this? I mean, so if you're a pure liberal theorist, you, the sort that follows on from Mill, and which a lot of political philosophers are pure liberal theorists, you think, oh, well, it's all just a matter of agreement. I'm a perfectly free individual and I trade some of my freedom for certain benefits in a society and so on and so forth, and it's all kind of contract stuff. I guess kind of the bog standard position in political philosophy. And the more conservative element says, well, that's just not going to work, because if the chips are down, then you just say, well, I'm no longer getting enough out of this, I'm off. So if it all is just a contract, the contract's not working, you have no obligation to stay. And you can't, the conservative point is, you can't really run a society where everybody is just going to default if it's no longer in their interests to carry on with the agreement. And nobody really knows quite what to do with this problem. But the answer is, one answer is, well, there's all kinds of things that kind of operate in the background. Things that sound a bit silly when you articulate them, like appeals to patriotism, or appeals to stuff that's greater than ourselves, or even something like appeals to the national, the need to preserve the National Health Service. There are these. As far as I can see, the only way through the midway between this kind of insane optimism of thinking that everything will be all right and human beings are naturally perfect, and the kind of rather dark side of thinking, oh no, we all need to be constrained, is that we kind of somehow need to be constrained a little bit and largely in the background. And that's the area of the kind of pre-political, non-political stuff that I suspect has a much larger role in actual political societies than is customarily recognized by political philosophy. And there I'll shut up. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Please do come and have a seat if you like, on your feet for a while. We'll take the lights up a little bit. We have James at the front who can dash around with a microphone. I'd like to say, please do put your hand up if you have a question. I have a couple. If we are slow thinking, no, we have questions already. So James, let's go one on the left and then one at the back right. That was yes. Yes, you had a question to me?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, good.
I wonder whether the term human nature has an embedded assumption, which is that all human beings are the same. If all human beings are not the same, and some are bad boys, how many people need to be bad to nail the argument of the classicists?
Yes, that's a very good point. In two respects, it is an assumption that we're talking at a kind of level of depth and abstraction that we're all going to be the same. What would be the justification of that assumption? Well, I guess in the end it would be evolutionary. So we're all basically the products of the same evolutionary story, and so we're all meant to be the same at some sort of fundamental level. But that doesn't really answer your question. If you go up a few levels, some people might be naturally good and some people might be naturally bad, and then the argument does start to fall to bits. But the second thing, and the thing which I completely ignored, is the very long tradition in this debate about whether there is a fundamental difference between the human natures of women and men, which is most of the great philosophers until fairly recently had a view about and wrote about, and so and which does underpin the nature of the state, in the sense that if you think that women are of a certain nature and men are of a certain nature, that might justify you in thinking, well, the way you set up your state is that men vote and women don't, or that women are assigned certain roles and men are not. I think Mill kind of knocked that on the head, but before Mill, that was pretty much the standard view.
We have one at the back on the right. Yes.
Thank you. Hello. Almost following on from that, the question really is what makes people bad if we're basically neutral or good when we're born. I was interested in your comment right at the beginning when you were first introducing classicism, and you talked about the man in America with his son who was maybe not necessarily doing bad things, but was not good, and then got into trouble and found ways of making himself better. And that was a sort of justification for, well, some people are bad and they need some sort of correction to make them good. But as a psychologist as well as a philosopher, my question would be what made the son go off the rails in the first place? Was he naturally bad, or was it something that had happened to him, like adverse childhood experiences or whatever?
Yeah, I think that's sort of what makes it so, as part of what makes it so difficult to sort it out as an empirical question, which it surely is. I mean, how do we know that those of us who good have been made good by certain circumstances, but would otherwise be bad, rather than those of the people who are bad have been made bad by circumstances, but would otherwise be good? I guess you could. I don't know. I mean, I think it's just too many counterfactuals in order to make it empirically testable. But I suppose you could, for people whose life had gone off the rails, if you did look at people whose life had gone off the rails and turned out that all of them had these adverse experiences, that might lend strength to the counterfactual that if people did not have these adverse experiences, they would be good. But the truth of counterfactuals is notoriously difficult to prove. If they didn't have those adverse experiences, they might still have been bad.
Yes. Would be a good start for another philosophical essay.
We have some more. There's one across on the left. Is that you, Robin?
That's me.
You're not usually allowed until the end.
Until the end, I'll go at the end.
Is it a
I'll
quick
go
one,
at the end. I'll go at the end. I know my place.
You got me thinking that I've always believed we're just animals, and human nature has a concept of good and bad. Animals are living freely, and I don't think there's any bad there. They kill to eat, they mate, and they survive. I don't think there's any natural badness in a free animal, but human beings do not behave that way, which challenges my concept of we're just animals anyway. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that the state of nature theorists, well, certainly one strand of them, certainly Rousseau, thought that in the state of nature we were like you describe animals. It's not, you know, if we killed somebody, it wouldn't have been a bad action because we would have killed, you know, if you killed something, then you kill for meat. Morality just morality doesn't apply to animals, and morality didn't apply to human beings in the state of nature. Although we do, in as much as we do say that animals behave bad in a good or bad manner, right? Which we do. I mean, especially things like dogs.
Friend's dog was
Yeah.
case in point.
Yes. I don't know whether that's anthropomorphizing. Whether it's just, you know, I'm not sure whether that is illegitimate anthropomorphizing. The trouble with saying that is I'm wary about excluding animals from the moral community. But if you include them in the moral community, then they have responsibilities.
Yes.
Do animals have the same hierarchy of needs, which is a lot of our motivation for doing bad things? Or do they just have a free life and it doesn't matter?
I don't know. I mean, I'm tempted with dogs to think that they. I mean, a dog knows when it's done something wrong. You know, dogs are terribly expressive when they're ashamed.
Or at least we think they look guilty.
Yes.
But I had a question just related to that, and I worry this is a slight please explain Rousseau to us all question, but from the quotation you had, he seemed to be implying, and you were just touching on it there, that morality doesn't really exist in the state of nature, and it sounded a little bit like a more sort of black and white version of what Nietzsche writes about with the genealogy of morality, and you have to sort of be disciplined into a different way of thinking entirely. But then, is it really plausible that there are no moral impulses and sentiments in the state of nature? And if so, why would we bother coming up with a state? Or what would be the reason to do that from the state of nature?
It's a good question. I'm not quite sure I mean, when Rousseau says, I mean, obviously he did it in French, but in English it says, you know, the move from the state of nature to the civil state is brings about a remarkable change in man. And then he goes and lists the various changes. So two options might be that our behaviour, that we might, you know, pick up an injured person, and so in the state of nature, we might be walking past somebody who's fallen over and hurt themselves, and we might stop and pick them up. And it might just be that's not rightly described in the state of nature as being an altruistic action or a moral action. It's just something that happens. So it might be that whole descriptive vocabulary is lacking. And if it's lacking, then there's no duties and oughts, etc., etc. Or it might be that he really did think that there was a massive shift, that people developed mental states that they hadn't previously developed. And it is a sort of very big claim that we shift out of a kind of stupid, limited state, as he says, and acquire sophistication somehow by the move from the state. And I mean, I wouldn't know how to make that plausible, except people like Nick Humphrey, who's a sort of evolutionary psychologist, says that, you know, our consciousness developed as a response to sociability. So maybe you could try and give it some kind of quasi-scientific backing. But I think the way to read him that makes most sense of what he actually says is that we do actually have this big physical psychological change, and we do just get different brains, different minds in the state of nature, sort of state.
Okay. Who else has a question? I know Robin here. Yes, we'll have. I can just see
What is the role of inhibition in all of this? Do we think that inhibition results from, the classicist would say, an imposed set of rules, or is it something that we're naturally good, and the inhibition is part of that natural goodness?
Ooh, I think you just have to take a choice. If you're a romantic in human terms, you would say the second, and if you're a classicist, you would say the first. I think it's sort of it works better on classicism, because if you're a real thoroughly head-banging romantic and you think that all our impulses are naturally good, then you wouldn't really need inhibition, because there would be nothing you would need to inhibit. But I think that it fits very naturally into the classical picture, because the classical picture would be that, you know, external pressure gets us to inhibits our natural behaviour, because our natural behaviour is not good, and so it does need inhibiting. So what putting us in uniform and marching us around does is it inhibits our behaviour in certain ways, which enables us to flourish.
And yet, going back to the philosopher's dog, which you've been referred to a few times, people like Conrad Lawrence would say that there are things which inhibit animal behaviour, which are learned, if you like, as with puppy lying on its back, exposing itself, and the other dogs being inhibited in their line of attack. So in other words, there can be natural, I think, natural inhibition.
Yeah. No, that sounds plausible to me, and I don't know what to say about it except to hope that it would just be natural inhibitions might just be neutral between the two stories of romanticism and classicism. I hope, but I take your point that, yeah, you'd have to find a place for it somehow.
Let's go. So we've got a few questions. We'll save you for the end, Robert.
Thank you.
Hone your question. We have one at the back towards the right. That's you? Yeah, not that one, as well, yes. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, apologies if this feels like a naive question. I'm a bit of an amateur, but I'll give it a go. In terms of the brain development, so the state can basically, before the state, when you're in a kind of state of nature, you've got a lot of things to juggle and think about, and fears and security, a lack of security, where actually then the state of a civil state can start to take away a bunch of those different things. So if you take like Maslow's hierarchy of needs or spiral dynamics, it's basically an evolution of what you have to think about and having more of your needs taken care of. So is it just possible that our brains then have more space to think about other things? So it's less about being good or bad, but it's just about having the space to be able to progress and to be able to develop.
Yeah, that seems right. And I think that's something like that does match onto the standard evolutionary story. But when you say it's not about being good and bad, I guess what Hume would want to say is, all right, let's agree. No, not really would actually. How about this? Regardless of when we get the headspace to form our characters, it's still going to be an open question as to whether the character formed is going to be a character that tends to the good or doesn't tend to the good. And so you're still going to have to face the question of how should we sort a state out such that we can best flourish. But I take it. But it does nicely spoil the nice state of nature to the civil state story if this whole thing has to begin in the civil state rather than the state of nature. Then the move from the state of nature to the civil state is not going to teach you very much. So, but if it all happens in the civil state once we get our headspace in order to develop our characters, you just have to locate the contrast there. Thank you.
Thank you. We have. Oh, yes, we've got. One next to you, just in front. Yes, and then one at the front. Oh, and Simeon. Sorry, I couldn't see you in the blue.
as well.
I was hoping you could say a little bit more about your association of positive freedom with the classicist view. I suppose my understanding of positive freedom is that it's more freedom as a kind of realization of our nature rather than a redirecting or rerouting of it. But I also see that it kind of encourages perhaps intervention to realise, which doesn't associate it with the more romantic view. So just interested if you could say a little bit more about that.
No, yeah, you pretty much hit the nail on the head in your last comment. I did reread the Berlin essay in preparation for this evening, and I was much more impressed by it than I thought I would. It's one of those. It's such a classic essay. You read it when you're an undergraduate, and then you think, okay, now I know it, and then now 40 years later I read it and think, no, really, it is quite good. But yes, it was just that. So if with the positive, with the positive freedom thing, if somebody says you have this dual nature, and part of your nature is your true nature, and you might not be fully aware of your true nature, and then it's open for somebody external to say, but I am fully aware of your true nature, what you really want. What you say you want is just what you appear to want, but it could be, and this is absolutely true, it could just be a desire generated by the advertising industry. You really, really think, I want this pair of shoes. But I don't really, it's not going to do me any good or make me any happier. Then somebody can come along and say, no, well, I'm a better judge of what you really want than you are. And then that starts to sound a little bit like classicism, because you say, well, I can tell you how you can really flourish by appealing to your better nature, which you don't know as much about as I do. So I'm going to set up the society in such a way that your better nature is revealed by imposing all these kind of constraints. So those are just the things I had in mind. It wasn't anything terribly clever.
Simeon, where are you?
James?
If pointing in the wrong direction, it's supposed to help.
In a way, the question I was going to ask, Derek got onto anyway, because it seems to me that the very neat either or we've been presented all evening doesn't really function, because there are very few examples in at least Western culture of the state of nature, as it were, existing as a group force, and that actually what the real question is within the classical model, how much freedom of nature either the state will allow us or we can attain for ourselves. And last point, I mean, we can elaborate this, great fun, but there's an analogy here, I think, with theology and the relationship between divinity and freedom of will, freedom of action. So I think I put it all on that side of the line, and the question is how much we can, it's not turning into a question, it's turning into a thought, but how much freedom of nature we retain within the state.
Yes, if I've understood you correctly, I think that's right, and I think that's where I was sort of hoping to end up. So if you take the Rousseau thought that we've got to be in a state, and then the question is what, and I think if you're a pessimist like Rousseau, I think he was a pessimist. If you think the state is going to mess us up to some extent, how should the state be designed so that it messes us up to the least extent possible? And then within that question, there can be within that thought, there can be the question of how much scope there is in the state. Is there in a state to leave us alone to carry out our natural to function as much as we can as just as natural human beings? So yeah, I agree that it is. I agree that the real questions are all on the classical side, because we have to be. It's inevitable that we're going to be constrained in some way. The question just is how.
We have two in the front, James, which I can actually point in the right direction. We have one just over here, and then.
Did the philosophers say how they were going to move from the state of freedom to a state of constraint. And how were they going to do this? Was this through something like education, like the Jesuits say, give me a child till he's 6 and he is mine forever? Would this be what they would do, or had they got a plan that was something different?
It's a nice question about, it crops up with Nietzsche and the genealogy of morality as well, which is to what extent do they think they were describing the actual, how things actually happened, the actual history of stuff, or were they just saying, here's an interesting hypothetical situation which we can try and learn from by seeing what we would do in a hypothetical situation. And I think with Hobbes, I mean, I'm no great Hobbes scholar, and I'd have to ask him. I should just ask Quentin Skinner, who is a great Hobbes scholar, and he would just tell me the truth about these things. But I think, at least on my reading of Hobbes, he's a hypothetical. He was a hypothetical concept theory. So I don't think they had a view on how it was done, because I don't think they ever really believed it did happen. I think they were just sort of saying, let's think about it this way and see what we can learn from thinking about it this way. So
it's like a sort of parable, isn't it? That
yeah.
kind of makes moral sense, that if you were in this position, you would have all agreed, right? So it's that sort of moral story rather than a historical.
And that enables them to do what philosophers are trained to do, which is to escape from any question that might have a bearing on fact.
Yeah. In a situation that never happened, people who never existed, obviously we would have all done such and such.
That's not really about
not convinced. We have another question here. James.
Hello, good evening. My question is this. Both views seem to me a bit primitive because they treat people like animals, like romanticists treat people like happy animals, and then classicists like evil animals. And my question is, was the notion of conscious mind available to both groups of philosophers at that time? Because if you look now at the Russian state, it's horrible. It makes people fascist and the rest of it. And then, my question is about conscious mind, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think they particularly Rousseau, was very interested in the conscious mind. I think that if I understand the direction of your question correctly, I think they would think that the danger is that we're not as autonomous as we like to think we are. So we might like to think that, given that we have our conscious minds, we can think freely, think what we like, not be pushed in one direction or the other. And I think Rousseau's worry was that if we're in a society, that society is inevitably going to push our minds in one direction or another, whether we like it or not. And I think he would. I think he would be very sympathetic to your example of the Russian state. I mean, as indeed Mill would have done. Mill had this thought that if you treat people badly, they will end up treating other people badly. So if you're mean to your servants, then your servants will be mean to the underservants, because they will just think that's a natural reaction. If you're mean to them, they'll be mean to the other. So I think he thought, I think he didn't think that our conscious mind was a particularly good bulwark against these kind of influences. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Well, if you look at the Russian state, it's very dangerous to human nature. So it's...
Yeah, no, I think absolutely.
Quite a strong classicist approach.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I do think that's a very good case, a very good instance. A very good example of the kind of thing that bothers people in this area.
Yes, and even good people, when they go into that state, they can become evil people. So it just proves that the state is not a solution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's right. You've got, any state is going to distort in some respect, and if you've got a state that's states always have the potential to make people horrible people. I think that was Rousseau's main worry.
I suppose, is there still a plausible claim by the Russian state that it is acting for the overall good of the people? Right, because on the Humean view, the reason to have lots of rules and constrain freedom and tell everyone what they ought to be doing is that it will be better for them, whereas in an autocracy, that's at best a pretense, right? There's no sincere thought that it's really in the best interests of the people to follow all these restrictive rules on their own freedom of expression, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think, and the Chinese and Vietnamese state are probably much more explicit about that. So the Communist Party is, in a sense, the guardians of the flourishing of the citizens.
Yeah, whether they like it or not.
Whether they like it or not.
We had a question in the back in the middle. Give you a bit more exercise, James. And then we might come to Robert.
Good evening. Did philosophers on either side of the argument address the issue of scale? And what I mean by this is it's one thing to be romantic at the individual level, or within a couple, or within a local philosophy club for that matter. But when you scale that up to the state, and whether that's a state of the size of Norway or the state of the United States, did they ever address this issue around how there were limitations when it came to the scale of this idea?
Yes, they did, but not in a way that's terribly helpful. So, for example, Rousseau sort of says that his philosophy... Rousseau was a citizen of Geneva at a time when Switzerland was broken up into those, well, it still is in cantons, but the cantons were quite small. And at the time, Rousseau says all kinds of things in all kinds of places, and he often contradicts himself. But he does say at one place that he doesn't see how his philosophy can apply to anything larger than the kind of Swiss canton that he's used to talking about. So I think you're right. I think the problems do change depending on what scale we're talking about. And that would need to be factored into the whole thing in a complicated manner. But yes, scale would be an issue.
Let's go to Robin.
Okay. Build up, yeah?
This is better.
Half an hour, come on.
I'm timing myself, okay? Thank you very much for a wonderful description of this particular dialectic, which is really interesting and fascinating. What jumps out for me is the attitude to hierarchy, and that classicism obviously epitomizes Aristotelian, Kantian imperatives, etc., as opposed to the romantic, almost leveling anti-hierarchy. So you're almost describing a political cycle. And I was just thinking that certainly if I was thinking about this particular dialectic, I would put it across that hierarchy, anti-hierarchy dimension. Thank you.
Hume does sort of talk about that a bit, doesn't he, in his essay, that it's time to move away from romanticism in some kind of world historical sense.
He's read the essay more recently. Yes, I think that is true. It is true. Yes, yeah. I think that's right. Yeah.
There's a little bit of a sort of Hegel type.
Yes.
We need to. Yeah. The pendulum needs to swing back. I think that's it.
I think that's right. I'm going to defer to my learned friend because that is my recollection.
But right. Hobbes and the Civil War and Marx and the Revolution.
I mean, he was right. Right at the beginning of modernism, where everything was shifting.
Sure.
And also he had a very good grasp of not only contemporary developments in philosophy, but also contemporary developments in art. He really was, and contemporary developments in poetry. He really was at the cutting edge of all this stuff. So I think he was acutely aware of the
hierarchy, the cycle.
Yeah.
Just as a last question, if we don't have any more, I wanted to ask about art, and I read some of Hume's poems, which are all pleasingly short and to the point. Often the moon sort of figures in them, and he talks about the moon looking like a ruddy farmer on the one hand, or a fleeing whatever on the other. They're sort of very sort of beautiful little fragments almost, and he seems very concerned about the impact of the right sort of art on politics and so on. And it reminds me, in the context of what you've been saying a little bit about Plato's Republic and the huge amount of structure that's required in Plato's supposedly ideal society. I think there's a question about how seriously it was all meant in the view of some people, but all these rules and structures that seem to be in place so that people don't hear the wrong type of musical scale at the wrong time and so on. What is this obsession with art? Is this a real concern that the wrong type of art would get us all on the wrong moral course? It doesn't seem to be a very pressing issue for the rest of us. The philosophers seem to be very concerned about it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of professionally, I'm an aesthetician, so I'm a vested interest in
so you're
saying
a bit concerned
art.
about this.
With Hume had he had been in Germany, and he was very influenced by the German aesthetics of the 1890s, which is immensely psychological. So he did think that that our minds and our feelings were moulded by external forms and art. So he would be crashingly optimistic to think that his imagist poetry was going to somehow change the world. He did put probably an unreasonable. I can't defend the huge importance he gave to art, but he did think it was important, and I suspect one of the reasons he thought it was important was because he had a much more psychological view of art than some of the others at the time. He was one of the people. He followed a German philosopher called Theodor Lipps, who is completely incomprehensible. And when he is comprehensible, you just think, oh God, it's wrong. You plough through. He wrote really, really big books. But a kind of interesting footnote to all this is that Lipps's theory gets cashed out in English by a woman called Vernon Lee, who's more famous for Gothic short stories. And she and this guy called Titchener, and Titchener in fact coined the word empathy to describe Lipps's theory. And Vernon Lee talks about the empathy, and it's a theory of beauty. The word empathy then disappears for 60 years, 50, 60 years. Doesn't completely disappear, but largely disappears until comes out in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and is now completely ubiquitous. So Lipps and Hume's kind of early thinking on aesthetics around 1890 actually did just an interesting footnote to history, was the groundwork for contemporary theories of empathy.
Okay.
Which is a sort of puzzling connection in the history of thought.
So there is something in it.
There is something in it.
Great. Well, on that happy note, before we thank Derek properly, just a heads up on our next talk, which is on the 21st of April. So 4 weeks' time, same place, same time, Tuesday, 21st of April. And we're going to return to a preoccupation of a lot of philosophers at the moment, which is the nature of artificial intelligence. And we've had a couple, I don't know if there's anything to do with your marking of undergraduate essays, but it certainly seems to be weighing heavily on lots of philosophers' minds at the moment. And so we're going to hear from Mona Simeon, who's a professor at the University of Oxford. And she's going to be looking at whether AIs are, in the jargon, epistemic agents. Like, do they actually know things? Can they really tell us things? Do they inquire into things? Do they speak to us in the way that people speak to us? And Mona is, I believe, an optimist, if that's the word, on this point. She's going to say that we have overwhelming evidence that large language models are in fact rational agents that speak to us and know things. So if you're interested in that, please do book on. That's on the OSO website. I'd like to say it was a really great discussion today, triggered by a fantastic talk from Derek, Professor Matravers. So thank you so much. We should have a question time vote at the end. So who's coming down on the view that human nature is hopelessly flawed and we need structure and discipline? Quite a lot of us. And who's on the romantic persuasion that we just need to be set free to flourish? Okay, so bad news. It's about 2-1 that we're horribly flawed. Off to Russia.